About History series. Koxinga died suddenly, and Zheng Jing succeeded.
Welcome to this explainer. History is rarely just a straight line. It so often pivots in the most chaotic, entirely unpredictable moments. And today, we're diving into a truly fascinating turning point, the year 1662. This was the year a series of extreme, almost unbelievable accidents essentially laid the very foundation for modern Taiwan. It all kicks off on June 23rd with the sudden, totally unexpected death of a 38-year-old leader named Chenggong. He had just seized Taiwan from the Dutch, but his premature death, well, it left a massive, violently vibrating power vacuum. A fierce succession battle immediately erupted between his eldest son and his uncle, basically throwing the island's future into absolute uncertainty. So once the dust finally settles on that internal crisis, the eldest son, a 20-year-old named Zheng Jing, emerges victorious through just sheer decisiveness. He becomes the new ruler of this island kingdom. But his opponent over on the mainland, well, the mighty Qing Empire was actually in its own state of transition following the death of the Kangxi Emperor. The new emperor, Kangxi, was literally an 8-year-old boy. He was relying entirely on powerful ministers to manage a vast continental empire. Just picture this high-stakes cross-strait standoff for a second. A 20-year-old youth trying to secure a wild, untamed island, directly opposed by an 8-year-old boy learning to rule an entire continent. It's almost absurd historical symmetry, but it set the absolute perfect stage for everything that followed.
Section 1. The Catalyst, a fatal blood feud.
While that massive geopolitical chess match was happening at the macro level, what actually tipped the scales wasn't some grand military strategy. It really came down to profoundly human flaws. Back in 1649, the late Zheng Chenggong and a brilliant commander named Shi Long had forged a really tight brotherhood, fighting side by side against the Qing. But honestly, their personalities were a ticking time bomb. Zheng demanded absolute, unquestioned authority, while Shi Long, incredibly talented, sure, but notoriously arrogant. The breaking point arrived with something called the Zheng Day incident. Basically, a subordinate named Zheng Day committed a crime and sought Zheng's protection. Shi Long, completely ignoring his commander's authority, aggressively hunted Zheng Day down and executed him anyway. This blatant disrespect triggered a catastrophic reaction. Zheng, in a blind rage, ordered the arrest of Shi Long and his entire family. Now, Shi Lang actually managed to escape Zheng's wrath, but his elderly father and his younger brother were left behind in the camp, and in a severe, ultimately fatal miscalculation, Zheng executed them. A blood feud that cannot share the same sky. That exact sentiment defined the rest of Shi Lang's life. This single, highly impulsive execution birthed a deep-seated hatred. Defecting back to the Qing Empire was no longer just some political calculation for Shi Lang. No, it became a lifelong, absolutely unstoppable mission to conquer Taiwan and avenge the extermination of his family.
Moving on to Section 2, the Island Grand Strategy.
Fast forward to 1664, and Zheng Jing had lost territories like Kinmen and Shemen, and was pushed all the way back, retreating entirely to Taiwan. Faced with Shi Long's terrifying vendetta and the overwhelming pressure of the Qing Empire, the island's leadership desperately needed a survival strategy. Enter Chen Yonghua. He was the brilliant mastermind, the ultimate architect of Taiwan's early development. Recognizing that mere military isolation would inevitably lead to collapse, Chen implemented a master plan. Historians actually often compare it to the famous Longzong Dialogue, which was a grand geopolitical strategy of antiquity. Chen realized they had to transform Taiwan from a temporary military outpost into a permanent, thriving, self-sufficient society. They literally had to build a functional civilization out of the wilderness.
And the economic boom under Chen, it was staggering. Just look at the numbers. During the previous Dutch era, the arable land in Taiwan was measured at just over 8,000 units. But under Chen Yonghua's highly aggressive agricultural and land reclamation policies, that number rocketed to over 18,000 units. He more than doubled the cultivated land, physically transforming the island's landscape just to feed a growing nation and secure their independence. And this agricultural miracle fueled a massive demographic flip. During the Dutch period, the Han population on the island was a mere 25,000. But thanks to that newly stable food supply and Chen's governance, by the 1680s, that population had skyrocketed to roughly 200,000. That's a complete structural transformation of the island's demographics in a remarkably short amount of time.
But listen, this kind of velocity of growth wasn't a lucky accident. Not at all.
Chen Yonghua orchestrated a carefully balanced, multi-pronged blueprint. He heavily pushed agricultural development, obviously, but he also fostered peaceful relations with the indigenous populations to ensure internal stability. He opened up foreign trade to bring in wealth, and, perhaps most importantly for the long term, he laid the groundwork for institutionalized education. He essentially built a new immigrant society entirely from the ground up.
But here's the thing. Economics and agriculture only goes so far when it comes to legitimizing a society. It brings up a really fascinating question for us to think about. How do you build a culture from absolute scratch? When your people are displaced and you're constantly facing the threat of war across the strait, how do you establish the deep intellectual and cultural roots required to truly bind a society together?
Well, the answer, remarkably enough, is a shipwreck. Yeah, amidst all this high-level geopolitical chess and top-down strategic planning, the actual dawn of Taiwan's literary culture came down to an event of sheer unbelievable randomness.
Get this, in 1649, a hurricane blew a scholar and former Ming official named Shen Guangwen wildly off course. He miraculously survives the shipwreck, washes ashore in Taiwan, and eventually just settles down in an indigenous village. And rather than falling into despair, this stranded intellectual begins practicing medicine, teaching farming, and most crucially, opening up classes to teach Han literature. He spent nearly 40 years there, quietly planting the grassroots seeds of local cultural dignity that went far deeper than any military conquest ever could. It's exactly why historians say Taiwan's written language begins with Guangwen.
Section 3. Building a Civilization.
So, Shen Guangwen's grassroots teaching sets an incredible stage, right? But it was our master strategist from earlier, Chen Yonghua, who recognized they needed to capture this cultural fire and institutionalize it to truly rival the Qing court back on the mainland, because a civilization needs formal structures. So, in 1665, Chen initiates a sequence that changed the island's identity forever. First step, he established the very first Confucius temple in Taiwan. Next, he used that as the foundation to create a complete state-run school system. And finally, he implemented a formal civil service examination system to select local talent. By legally embedding Confucian culture directly into the societal framework, he was making a massive political statement. He was proving to the whole world that they were no longer just some savage frontier, but a highly organized, completely civilized state.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, the legacy of 1662.
When we pull back and look at the big picture, the incredible butterfly effect of the 1660s is just breathtaking. Think about it. From the sudden death of a young leader, to an impulsive execution that sparks a lifelong blood feud, to a random hurricane blowing a scholar onto the shore, these volatile extreme accidents, mixed with some genuinely visionary leadership, accidentally but inevitably laid the very foundations of modern Taiwan's demographics, its economy, and its enduring culture. As we wrap up this explainer, it really makes you wonder about our own era. Ask yourself, what actions, what structures, what ideas are we building in our current chaos today that will still matter and still echo 3 centuries from now? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.